Welcome to Parenting in the Age of Coronavirus, a new podcast from the Murdoch Children's Research Institute in Melbourne. I'm Professor Julie Green from the Raising Children Network and the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, or MCRI, and in this podcast series I'll be joined by child and adolescent health experts to unravel some of the challenges parents are facing and to explore how we can best support children and young people to continue to learn and develop and thrive throughout the pandemic. Before starting, MCRI would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're located, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge Medibank for their support in making the podcast available. Today, I'm joined by adolescent physician Professor Susan Sawyer, Director of the Centre for Adolescent Health at the Royal Children's Hospital, and also co-lead of the Adolescent Health Research Group at MCRI. We're also joined by psychologist Dr. Rohan Borschmann, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Adolescent Health, and Rohan's research focuses on the mental health of adolescents. A warm welcome to you both. Susan, can we start with you? What do we know about what young people are experiencing at the moment during the pandemic? What are they going through?
Look, I think anyone with young people would know that they're probably experiencing exactly the same as what we as adults are experiencing at one level. And they'll be experiencing it differently as well. So some of them, like us, will be worried that someone they love or care for will get sick. Some of them will be worried that they might get infected, particularly those who are still attending school or are working part-time. Many of them will be disappointed that their various activities have been cancelled, particularly significant events. But perhaps overwhelmingly, they're going to be incredibly frustrated that they can't hang out with their friends and they're unable to see their extended family. And perhaps like some of us as adults, might be feeling a bit overwhelmed by the constant coverage of coronavirus as well in the media, particularly on social media. But look, I think overwhelmingly for young people, certainly those that I see clinically, a number of them are just fed up with not being able to see their mates and are anxious, particularly those in upper secondary school, about the implications of not being able to physically be at school on their studies, notwithstanding the extent of what schools have done to try and promote continuity of learning as much as possible. So this is particularly for those who are in Year 11 and Year 12.
Okay, thanks. We might come back to a couple of those points as we go. But Susan, what would you advise, or what tips would you give parents that might help them approach talking about COVID-19 compared to, say, talking with younger children? What is it about conversations that young people that might be really helpful for parents to bear in mind?
Look, I think it's a really important question because, clearly teenagers are much more aware of what's going on in the world than younger children. They're much more socially connected, yet they're not necessarily more informed with reliable information. And so I think one of the really important things still for families is not to assume that just because young people are so well connected socially means that they are informed about coronavirus, about physical distancing, about the importance of self-isolation, notwithstanding the fact that by now, so many weeks into this, it feels self-evident. So I think it's about still finding time to talk with young people. And as you'll remember from those conversations that every parent has with their teenagers, those times to talk are often more when there's side-by-side activities rather than face-to-face. So trying to replicate the sorts of conversations that parents might have historically had when they were in the car driving kids to sport or driving to the supermarket. So, in these COVID-19 times, maybe it's a good time to make time to talk, might be whilst you're preparing dinner together. Obviously, for parents, staying calm yourself, having these conversations is always a good start. But rather than making assumptions about what your child is concerned or fearful or wants to know about, it's basically simply asking them how they're travelling, what are they hearing about in terms of the changing focus on, lockdown, what are their thoughts about that, what do they know, what are their friends saying, and finding space to as much listen as share.
Okay, there's some great tips into conversations there. Thanks for that. And because for young people in the secondary school age years, I mean, it is a time where they are exploring their identity. They might be challenging rules or decisions within the family anyway. So what might this mean for parents in having to work their way through conversations with their young people? So, Rohan, I'm thinking, what might your take be from a developmental perspective, on what parents might need to bear in mind as they're dealing with perhaps pushback around decisions or having to renegotiate what young people are allowed to do or not allowed to do at the moment?
Well, adolescence is the developmental period when sensation seeking and the need for testing boundaries is at an all-time high, especially in boys. However, we know that the adolescent brain isn't fully developed yet, and it will continue developing until at least the mid-20s. So teenagers in particular are undergoing huge changes in their brain structure and function, and this makes them even more sensitive to their social environment and the importance of that social connection with their friends. So we have this unique situation with adolescents where they're often desperate to push boundaries and establish their independence, but the parts of their brain that will ultimately help them make the most sensible choices haven't finished developing yet. So it's like they have an incomplete emotional toolkit at a time when they need it the most. And it's important to remember that all this is going on even when there's not a global pandemic with adolescents. So once we add in the lockdown restrictions and social distancing enforcements into the picture, it's probably to be expected that we're seeing even more pushback from young people.
Okay, so your top tips for parents then, Rohan?
In terms of advice for parents, I guess there are a few things that we can do. First, we need to validate their disappointment, I think, by acknowledging that it's totally normal that they want to hang out with their friends and empathise with them that, it's unfortunate they can't do that at the moment. You've got to remember that a whole range of social activities have been cancelled for them that they do find really enjoyable, like parties and sporting events and music festivals and other major events. So that has to be really difficult for them. Secondly, we should encourage them to connect virtually with their friends via FaceTime or Zoom or Google Hangouts or any other virtual forum that they may use, because this social connection is super important for adolescents. And of course, we might need to lower the bar a little in terms of the usual screen time limits for that to happen. And thirdly, I think we definitely need to keep talking with our young people about COVID-19 and also about the widespread consequences that it's having beyond the restrictions on their social lives. So we could gently encourage them to see that the social distancing measures that are in place aren't really about them. They're more about the more vulnerable people in society, such as older people, grandma and grandpa. And we could even try and personalize it for them by confronting questions like, what if it was grandma or grandpa who got sick because of a choice that you and your friends made to get together and hang out? Or if they've got friends or family members who might be doctors or nurses or any frontline health professionals, or uni students who are studying to become one of those professionals, how would they feel if that person contracted COVID-19 at work because of a decision that they'd made to hang out with their friends? And as Susan just mentioned, it's important to keep a calm and reassuring tone when we're having these conversations, especially noting that parents might be feeling a bit stressed out themselves. So it's probably worth taking a few deep breaths before you start these conversations.
Great. So perhaps, Susan, might you have anything to add to that? I'm particularly thinking about how to get a balance. I think Rohan's touched on being flexible, but how might parents help their young people strike a balance between, their learning commitments, fun, staying connected, screen time, screen-free time?
The challenge for every parent, isn't it? And I think to be reinforcing what Rohan has just said, that there are some things that don't change in this pandemic and that need to create balance, and the parental role in terms of negotiating with young people and finding a balance between all of that doesn't change just because we're in a pandemic. But I think in terms of schooling, perhaps is where, obviously with kids, the majority of kids having to be at home, I think that's where there is probably the biggest challenge. And I think one of the things that's really important for parents to appreciate that just like it's for us at work, it's normal that there is an interplay between the learning aspects or the work that we do and the social aspects of work. Just like we as parents sometimes, I think, need to be reminded that it's normal for kids to talk with their friends throughout the school day, and that it isn't always clear-cut about where that overlap between learning and socialisation starts and ends. And so I think one of the really important things for parents to perhaps be reassured about is that if their child's learning is progressing well from an educational perspective, then there's probably less need for concern. And therefore suggesting that if schools aren't already providing a regular context by which there can be feedback to parents on a weekly basis about the fact that their people are okay about things, or providing space for parents to be engaging with teachers, then that's something that parents should be given authority, in a sense, to engage with their child's school if they've got some particular concerns. But I think it's really recognising that across the day, across the week, there's a number of hours in the day, and those hours need to be balanced between learning, socialising, physical activity, and family time. And that's the balance that parents have regardless of the pandemic that we're living through.
Okay, thank you. I think going to the issue of anxiety, which is often on parents' minds as their kids go through adolescence and negotiate social situations, school, family situations, and so on. But perhaps whether it's magnified at the moment, especially for the older secondary school age kids that Susan mentioned earlier, with disrupted timetables and assessments and so on. Rohan, how might parents be able to really tell the difference between what normal levels of anxiety look like and when to start getting concerned and perhaps seeking help? What's the range of behaviours in normal, around normal anxiety, and what are more worrying signs?
So that's a good question. I mean, we know right off the bat that anxiety is the most common mental health concern in secondary school age adolescents. And it's really important to remember that feeling anxious is part of the normal range of emotions. So it's normal to feel a bit anxious if you're going to a party where you might not know many people, for example, or if you're sitting an exam or giving a classroom presentation. So it's a normal reaction to stress or difficult times. And it's safe to say that we are living in difficult times at the moment with the pandemic. So although a bit of anxiety is normal from time to time, if these feelings don't go away or if they become more intense, that can really interfere with a young person's life, whether that's concentrating on their schoolwork or socialising with friends or just generally enjoying life. And although chronic anxiety is a serious problem and can lead to other serious mental health problems, I think the kind of low-level short-term anxiety that most teenagers will probably feel as a result of the pandemic is unlikely to cause too many long-term problems if it's handled well in the here and now. So I think as parents, we should pay attention if our teenagers tell us that they're experiencing any of the normal symptoms of anxiety, which might be things like a racing heartbeat or having a dry mouth or sweaty palms, upset tummy perhaps. But there are also several other ways that anxiety can show up in young people that you might not associate with anxiety. So, for example, if a young person's having difficulty sleeping, or if they're having trouble concentrating or focusing on their schoolwork, or becoming angry and irritable more than a normal teenager might, which might be difficult to tell, or if they're having emotional outbursts that seem to come out of nowhere, these might be signs that they're feeling a little more anxious than normal. And in terms of support that we might be able to offer, I think firstly, this one's obvious, but it's just letting them know that we're there for them, no matter what. So parents know their kids better than anyone does. So if you see any changes in their behaviour, you should address that and talk to them about it. I think it's important that we help our young people to try and stay positive and optimistic, which can help them feel better about themselves and keep them energized and focused on their goals. In terms of specific strategies, we could encourage, basic mindfulness exercises to keep their anxiety in check. Even just things like really simple deep breathing exercises where you breathe in slowly through your nose for 4 seconds, hold it for 4 seconds, breathe out through your mouth for 6 seconds. Repeat that a few times and you'll typically notice that you physically become a bit more relaxed at least. And also, I'm not sure whether this one will help too much, but we should remind our young people that despite any disadvantages that they might be experiencing in terms of exam timetable or school assessments and things like that, they're probably no more disadvantaged than any of their peers. Essentially, they're all in it together. So any disadvantage that they will be experiencing won't put them in any worse position than their friends when it's time for university, for example.
And it's probably a good time to remind ourselves that general practices are still open. Susan, you referred to still seeing young people clinically. So have you got anything to add to that, Susan, in terms of families reaching out for support or assessment if need be?
Look, all of the supports that are typically available in the community from professionals are still available, including by new means that have never been available, such as telehealth. So I'm not seeing patients in person at the moment, but using telehealth, which in somewhat interesting ways actually can promote accessibility to healthcare, at least for some people. All of the support lines have had additional many of the telephone support lines have had additional supports, and there are obviously a lot of online resources, not just the Raising Children Network that you would know so much about, Julie, but also Beyond Blue, Origin. There are a whole range of online resources as well that are available for young people.
Thanks very much for those reminders. And of course, many of our young people are engaged in social issues, community activities that they feel very passionate about anyway, pre-COVID. What might be some ways that parents can foster that ongoing connection to issues and activities that are important to young people, notwithstanding restrictions around physical distancing and so on? Rohan?
Well, one of the silver linings of this pandemic, I think, is that a lot of young people will actually have more free time. So if they're not allowed to play sport or go to work or hang out in person with their friends, they might be able to direct some of that time and energy into an activity or a pastime that's close to their hearts. So this could be physical exercise or music or volunteering or a whole range of things. And as parents, I think we should definitely encourage this, as long as it adheres to the physical distancing guidelines and everything that you just mentioned, Julie. Anything that can be done online should be encouraged. And people have been really creative. We've all seen over the last few months that entire industries, our whole world has moved online with things like the telehealth that Susan just mentioned. Even the PE classes at my daughter's primary school have become online classes, which is something I never would have thought would be possible a few months ago, but here we are, and they're working really well. So if young people are able to engage in any activities that they feel passionate about, either online or offline, I think as parents, we just need to give them the time and the space and the means to do so, and perhaps including the additional screen time that might require.
Could I also add that I think that we sometimes forget that boredom is actually good for children and young people, and that it's often only through the experience of being bored, of not knowing what to do, that it actually forces kids to turn inwards to their own resources to think about, well, what would I like to do? And how might I do that? And I think sometimes for families, there's a risk that we jump in as parents and want to, if you like, fix things for kids who are themselves typically adept at being able to fix things or mend things themselves if they're given half a chance and if they're given the support from family to do so. I think the other point I would make is that notwithstanding adolescence is a time where young people typically move beyond the family and sort of move out into the world, so to speak, and really need the social connection to their friends that no doubt parents are very much supporting. I think it is also important to appreciate that family remains the foundation of young people's health and well-being. And I think, therefore, parents attending to their own emotional well-being, connecting with their own social networks, making sure that they're staying fit, active, feeling on top of things in this, chaotic time, as easy as it might be to say and as hard as it might be to experience, is actually really critical. And I'm always reminded of the airline safety commercials that sound so weird to start with, fit your own oxygen mask before attending to your children. You stop and think about it, and then you realize, yep, that's what we really need all to be doing. And I don't think we should be feeling guilty about that. Rather, as parents, we need to be recognizing that it is really important that making sure that we ourselves are feeling sufficiently robust that we can deal then with the angry outbursts of others in the family without a punitive response is important.
I think there's a lot in what you're saying, that modelling the kind of behaviour in terms of self-care and balance has great benefits to kids as well as parents. Thanks for that. And, to this theme of young people being so connected to their friends and, the centrality of a peer group to young people, many of our young people are going to be so happy to be back at school once, that transition starts. But at the same time, might there be any issues about returning to pre-COVID routines that may come with their own challenges, Susan?
Look, I think there's going to be some tremendous challenges, and indeed for all of us, not just young people. And I think, as we're increasingly being exposed to changing and lessening of the lockdown, I think it's the recognition that lessening the lockdown will be a process, not an event, and that things won't immediately go back to where they were before. And indeed, it may take much more time, and it will be about learning new norms. And I think that this is going to be very tough for all of us, perhaps adults indeed, more than young people. And I like to think that where we are now is not the beginning of the end, but as Winston Churchill said so famously back in, I think it was back in the early 40s, it's as if we're at the end of the beginning. And so I think thinking about what this looks like over the next weeks to months, as we have done well in Australia in terms of reducing the potential impact. And I think that now perhaps is the time, even as much as it was right at the start, where it's going to be much harder, I think, to be engaging with young people around why it is that as each stage changes in terms of the lessening of the lockdown, these messages are going to need to be so clearly reinforced by everyone. And I think that this is where potentially, with different states doing things at different timing, it's going to be much more challenging for young people who are going to perhaps feel that it's unfair, and that, why can they do one thing in one state and not us in another state? And I think it is going to require parents, schools, our political leaders and other leaders in the community to be really aligned and consistent in the messaging that we're communicating to young people, which has been incredibly effective with all of us in the early phases. But I think it is going to be perhaps as big a challenge, to be honest, as we move into lessening the lockdown.
Okay, thank you both so much. I think that was a really helpful discussion with lots of takeouts. For example, I think you've left us with important messages about keeping communication channels open with young people at home, the importance of structure and family to our young people's well-being, and some great tips there on what normal anxiety looks like, the importance of tapping into help where needed, and also the value in looking down the road, looking ahead and anticipating what's coming so that we can prepare and support our young people. So thank you both so much for that discussion. I'd also like to thank Medibank for its support in making the podcast series possible. If you've got any questions, our listeners, please let us know through sending us a message to podcasts@mcri.edu.au. And if you have family or friends you think would benefit from hearing the podcast, share it with them, give us a rating. And for any of the issues that we've touched on today, you can visit raisingchildren.net.au. There's also other help and support from Origin, Headspace, Beyond Blue, health.gov.au, esafety.gov.au and 1-800-RESPECT. If you found this helpful, tune in. We're going to be back very soon. Thanks for joining us.